Hello and welcome to Emphasis. We'll be speaking with Senator Paul Simon, a Makanda resident, a Southern Illinoisan. Senator Simon, welcome to Southern Illinois in image and spirit, if not in person and presence.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Gary.
You're not with us, of course. I don't know if the viewers can tell that just yet or not. You're in Washington, D.C., and coming to us by satellite here at WSIU-TV. You are there because there's some pretty important things going on in the Senate and Congress, Capitol Hill in general, particularly the budget. Let me read to you what your colleague, Senator Fritz Holling, said last week. This past week is just about the worst government I've ever seen in Washington, which is saying a lot, he said. Secret summits, pollster politicians, deceitful claims, dangerous policy, abdicated responsibility. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I'm pretty pessimistic in terms of what we have done. Now, we are finally, slowly, awkwardly getting a hold of the deficit a little. We are not moving as decisively as we should. There is a reluctance on the part of leaders of both parties to face up to things that, frankly, are not popular. And when you have to do those unpopular things just before an election, it's particularly difficult. But the leaders in Congress of both parties have moved very gingerly. The president didn't move at all up until 6-8 weeks ago. I think finally we're coming there, but we have a long way to go to really give the assurance to the financial markets and others that we're really getting a hold of our problems so that interest rates could come down.
You mentioned the word leaders a couple of times there. I get the feeling that that's part of the problem. We don't have a whole lot of leadership in Congress and in the White House particularly. Do you think that's true?
Well, it is true, but it is easy to blame, George Mitchell or Tom Foley or Bob Dole or Bob Michael. One of the problems is that we are electing far too many people who simply hold their finger to the wind and say, what do the latest polls have to say? And then they will follow whatever the shift in the winds of public opinion may be. That makes it very, very difficult for leaders to lead. You can't lead if you don't have somebody following you.
One of the areas a few months ago or even weeks ago that we were talking about, hopefully, was the peace initiatives, that the peace process has led to less military expenditure, and that we'd see this dividend, the peace dividend we called it. Has that evaporated, or is there still some hope there?
Well, there's not much hope, and there ought to be a lot of hope. It's very interesting. After World War II, we reduced defense spending 90% in 3 years. Now we are, as part of this budget package, virtually locking in the present level of spending. We are spending about 60% of our defense dollar for a possible Soviet invasion of Western Europe, and that has all but disappeared as a threat. We're spending 3 times as much per capita for the defense of Western Europe as the Western Europeans are spending. We're spending about $9 billion a year in Japan for the defense of Japan. And Japan now, while it has a limited military, it is still the 3rd largest military in the world today. We really ought to be cutting back very substantially. The difficulty is the pressures from the various industries those pressures manage to dictate what we do. A good illustration was the conference on the Armed Services Committees. The one house knocked out 3 weapon systems. The other house knocked out 2 weapon systems. As it turned out, they were different weapon systems. So the 2 houses got together to work out the compromise, as you have to do, between the House and the Senate. And you know what the compromise was? They agreed to keep all 5 weapon systems.
I was told recently, however, that you have never voted against a military appropriations bill in your time on Congress. Is that true?
Well, I think that is not quite accurate, but it is almost true, because you have to support people who are in the armed forces. For example, right now we have people in the Middle East. So while I did vote to cut Star Wars, and I voted to knock out the MX missile, and voted to stop the B-2 bomber, and some of these things, when it comes to the final appropriation, I do believe that you just can't cut off people who are in the Middle East, for example. So I do believe in sustaining those who are in the armed forces. But I have been one of the leaders in saying, let's cut back on the kind of defense expenditures we have. And I might add, this isn't just pie in the sky kind of thing. Bob McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, has suggested a 10% cut over a 5-year period each year in defense spending. That's a very modest cut when you see what has happened in the world in the last 18 months.
The military appropriations bill is being debated within the next few hours, probably, I believe, in the Senate. Do you have a position on that? Will you vote against this appropriation bill?
Well, it'll depend on what emerges there. Again, I vote for cuts, but I do believe that you just can't say we're not going to fund the military at all.
In the last few weeks, with the talks about the budget bill, one of the areas that has been targeted for cuts the most prominently, discussed most prominently, has been entitlements, some domestic spending, particularly Medicare and Social Security spending for the aged. I've also read recently that if you factor out military spending and interest on the debt, that spending for Americans over age 65 accounts for 47%, almost half of the budget. Has there been a lot of pressure to cut back, and has there been a lot of pressure to resist those cuts?
Well, there has been pressure to resist those cuts, and properly so, I might add. I am not very sympathetic to those who say, well, we really ought to be cutting back on Social Security recipients. The reality is Social Security is a self-funding thing. We ought to take it off the budget. And the reason that those who are over 65 are such a high percentage of the budget when you take defense and interest off is that we have had these massive cutbacks on the social programs under the Reagan administration and to a lesser extent under the Bush administration. The problem is not what we're doing for older Americans. The problem is what we're failing to do for education in urban America, what we're failing to do for people who need jobs and who need housing and those kind of things.
In a former life, I recall writing an editorial saying that ought to be taken off the budget. I remember your saying that too, at least a year ago, probably close to 2 years ago. Why hasn't it happened in all that time?
Well, we're finally inching in this direction. The Budget Committee of the Senate has now passed a bill that would do that. They have also passed a bill of mine that would take Medicare off the budget. I think within the next year or two we'll finally achieve that victory. We're getting very close to having the votes to do it now.
There's another point of view, though, that spending for the elderly is increasing, and perhaps rightly so, as you suggest, but spending for the young, children in particular, who don't vote, who don't have much of a lobby in Washington, on Capitol Hill in particular, has been declining in real terms over the last 15 to 20 years. Is there something we can do about that? Does that mean more spending?
There sure is something we can do about it, and that does mean, frankly, more spending on those kind of programs for education, for health care, for that sort of thing. One of the things that is happening in our society, and it's less true, frankly, in Carbondale and Makanda and southern Illinois than it is in much of America, but we are increasingly an economically segregated society. If you have a certain income level, you live in one area of town. If you have another income level, you live in another area of town. The poor are less and less our neighbors, and so there's less and less concern. Their problems are not visible, and a lot of the poor are children, and they're suffering. There's just no question about that. We ought to be more sensitive, but we have had national leadership that, frankly, has told us, you take care of yourself, and greed is a good thing. You even had a commencement at Stanford where the commencement speaker, I'm told, had used as his theme, greed is good. Well, that has, it may not have been that overtly out there for everyone, but that's kind of been the underlying theme of the last 10 years. We have to change that.
Sounds awfully liberal of you, Senator.
Well, I try and avoid phrases or labels like liberal, conservative. But if we're talking about the future of our country, and that's what we ought to be talking about, then we have to be concerned about children and their education and their health. And I'm willing to argue that issue with anyone, anywhere.
Well, then the question becomes, how do we pay for that? Are we able to cut back enough in other areas? Or are we going to have to tax a little more to spend a little more?
Well, the answer in part was your earlier question on defense. We have to make a decision. Do we really need another aircraft carrier, a nuclear carrier with a flotilla that goes around it? It's going to cost $18 billion when we have all these other pressing needs and when the threat to us around the world is diminished greatly. You know, the answer is, I think, very, very clear. The second is a priority among the other things that we spend money for. 1949, the fiscal year 1949, the federal government spent 9% of its budget on education. This fiscal year, if you exclude school lunches, we will spend 2% of our federal budget on education.
One thing that we are involved in these days, you mentioned the first part of that answer, is defense, and we are involved in a, I don't know if you would, how do you characterize it, a defensive or offensive military exercise in the Middle East?
Well, I think it is defensive up to this point, and I have to say, up until now, I think the administration has handled it well, though I have real concerns with Dick Cheney announcing we want to send another 100,000 troops over there. I think it's becoming too much of an American operation, and for both political and military reasons, I think that is not a desirable thing.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. If I can just add,
sure.
We had last week, as we're taping this, a meeting with Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, and several of us made the point to him that we think the administration has handled this well, but we don't want to see any unilateral offensive action against Iraq and Kuwait that would mean massive loss of life without congressional approval. I think we ought to be firm but patient. And if we are firm and patient, then frankly, we're going to get change in Iraq. I do not want to see us suddenly launching military offensives.
The former commander of U.S. forces in the Gulf said last week that the 300,000 was certainly enough to protect the oil fields and even Kuwait if that ever came to be our position. But the 100,000 in his eyes was certainly a readiness to invade Kuwait and take it over. That we couldn't do it with the ground forces we had now. So it looks like, at least in that expert's eyes, we were preparing for an offensive maneuver. Would you support that?
I would not, unless, now I think we have to respond. If Saddam Hussein attacks, then we respond. But I think we ought to be following our present posture, tightening the noose economically on Iraq. It's very interesting. Jordan now has fully joined in the economic boycott, obviously with some reluctance, but nevertheless has done that. The noose is tightening. Let's do it with economic means, not military means.
In the very first week of this encounter, I believe you proposed bombing the pipelines of Iraq. Is that a good idea still? Was it a good idea then?
It was a good idea then. It was fortunately not necessary. This was at a time when we were talking about a naval blockade by the United States alone, unilateral. I said, if there's to be a naval blockade, it ought to be through the United Nations, and it ought to be all the nations. And rather than a naval blockade, which would run the risk of military encounter and real loss of life, that the pipeline that went into Turkey and Saudi Arabia and at that point was flowing, that those two pipelines could be blown up without the loss of any life at all and still have a great impact on the economic life of Iraq. Fortunately, both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have cut off the flow of oil.
Aside from the violence that happened in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem last week, a couple of weeks ago now, there's been some talk about linking an entire Middle East conference, linking Israel and the Palestinian question to a settlement between Iran. Would you be in favor of a Middle East conference talking about all of these things at the same time?
Well, I'm in favor of the idea of a Middle East conference. I don't think it's probably wise to link everything. I think we have to move on the Iraq-Kuwait problem, and that should mean Iraqi troops withdrawal and also the potential for Iraq to build chemical weapons and also nuclear weapons. But then I think we're in a situation where we can move to a Middle East conference and an overall settlement. One of the major leaders in that area of the world told half a dozen of us in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee recently that their country is willing to move and negotiate with Israel and try and reach an overall settlement. I think for a variety of reasons we are very close to the point where that can be worked out if we can get the Iraq-Kuwait thing settled. And let me just add, it is a much more achievable thing than, say, a year ago, fall of Berlin Wall might have appeared to be, or even President Sadat going to speak at the Knesset.
Peace in the Holy Land is not achievable unless there are two sides to talk about it, of course. Who in the Palestinian side do you think is a credible negotiator at this point?
Well, I think that can be worked out. There are a variety of ways of doing it, but obviously a Jordanian delegation to any peace talks will include Palestinians. The fact that Arafat has lost support with Saudi Arabia, with Syria, with some of the other Arab countries, I think eases the transition as far as Israel sitting down and negotiating.
Wouldn't you support the idea of self-determination elsewhere in the world? And if so, shouldn't the Palestinians be able to choose their own representatives?
Well, if you ask an abstract question on self-determination, I am for it, but it is not. The Kurds want their own place, the Armenians want their place, the Azerbaijanis want their place. We can't have just a proliferation of nations around the world. Now, I do believe that part of the ultimate solution will, in the Middle East, be some kind of Palestinian entity. Whether that is a confederation with what it is, I am not sure. But I think we have to let the nations of that area decide that, including Palestinian representation.
Our own nation has its own share of problems, I suppose, and I would guess, just see if you agree with this, that in the last few minutes, as we've been talking about things on the other side of the world, that the attention has been drifting a little bit. Do you think there's
that could very well be, and that's probably my fault, not yours, Gary.
Well, I don't know about that, but do you sense a growing, and I hesitate to use the word isolationism, but let's say a greater concern with our own problems in America?
Well, I think that is true, and we ought to be concerned about our problems. There's no shortage of things that need to be tended to here in our country, but we are tied in with the rest of the world, as the presence of people from southern Illinois in Saudi Arabia indicates so clearly. We can't pretend that we can just be isolated from the rest of the world, and so we have to move, but it really takes national leadership. Very interesting, after World War II, under the Marshall Plan, we spent 2.9% of our gross national product in helping the poor beyond our borders. Today, we're spending less than 1/5 of 1% to help the poor beyond our borders economically. You ask almost anyone what percentage of our federal budget is going for foreign aid, and they will come up with all kinds of figures. The reality is foreign economic aid is less than 1% of the federal budget.
Problems we already alluded to in the budget discussion was the Medicare in particular, and how that entitlement is growing. One of the reasons it's growing is because health care costs themselves are growing, particularly those faced by older Americans. Is there a way to solve the problem of the high cost and the lack of access in many areas, particularly here in southern Illinois, to adequate health?
I think there is a way, and I think it is tied in with an overall health delivery system. I think within the next years, we will adopt some kind of modified Canadian system. Exactly what it's going to look like, I don't know, but we ought to be getting physicians and nurses and hospital administrators and consumer lawmakers together and say, let's start looking at this and let's start addressing this. In the meantime, there are short-range health delivery problems that we have to pay attention to. Some of them in Illinois and in other areas where we have a shortage of personnel or a shortage of trauma centers, but the other problems are long-term care, and those numbers are going to explode on us very shortly. We have about 31 million Americans with no health insurance coverage whatsoever, and about 7 million Americans who are inadequately insured. If I were to ask you right now, Gary, do you have insurance or not, you would know the answer. If I were to ask you how much health insurance you have, if you are covered, chances are you would not know the answer. Now, you may be the exception to the rule, but most people don't know if they're covered or not. And what happens is you may have $100,000 worth of coverage, which seems like a huge amount, but lung cancer or some other serious problem, $100,000 can disappear very, very quickly.
You used the phrase, just the problems exploding on us. And I wonder if looking down the road 5, 10 years and saying, well, we might get some people talking about these problems, whether that's really sufficient to solve and begin to solve some of these problems. And that gets to the question of the growing cynicism that I sense and that people in Washington talk and write about an awful lot, Americans, particularly among the electorate, that whether these problems are really being addressed sufficiently and point. Do you feel they are?
They are not. Just no question about it. And the cynicism has been aggravated by the system we have for financing political campaigns, so that we are responsive to those who have money than to those who do not have money. And well, we have seen it in the discussion on the budget in terms of who gets the tax. In the last 10 years, you have seen these massive tax breaks for the wealthiest of our people. And I hasten to add, I voted against every one of those. But middle-income America, percent of middle-income America is paying more in taxes than they were 10 years ago. The wealthiest of Americans, their taxes have gone down from 70% to 28%. And that's just symptomatic of how we are responding through financial contributions to the wealthiest. But pay attention to these other problems, and the American people are ready to respond. For example, I've mentioned the long-term care thing. I have said we ought to have a % increase in Social Security to pay for it, so we have a pay-as-you-go system. Easy whenever I mention this, but the reality is I don't run into opposition large on this. If they see our tax money going for a needed purpose, they're ready for it.
The ways we've seen the cynicism manifest itself in the last few weeks is the idea of a law, if just voting out the incumbents, a law that would say you would limit the terms of particular politicians at different levels. Do you think?
I do not, and as far as I'm concerned, you could apply it to me, and that. But you have, first of all, a good example. Congressman Jake Pickle knows more about Social Security than any member of Congress by far. He's about 25 years. If we were to lose Jake Pickle, it would be a real loss. I think we're better off leaving that up to the people. Now, there are those who say, well, we have too high re-election percentage among incumbents, particularly in the House. And there is no question about that. The way you change that is to change the system of financing campaigns, not what people can do.
Well, at the same time, we have all these incumbents in, and yet we're in a pickle, no pun intended. We have all of these problems now, and the incumbents, I would guess, for lack of anyone else to blame, are the ones who created some of these problems or did not address the problems. So how do we go about changing it in the meantime?
Well, the term limitation requires a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate. It's great political talk about term limitation. It has absolutely no chance of passage. What does have a chance of passage, if we get enough people wrought up about it, is to change how we finance campaigns. To ask if we were to put strict limits on what should be spent, and ask every taxpayer, when you income tax, if you want to, check off that you will have $3 sent to finance campaigns in the House and the Senate. And then the Republican and the Democratic candidates after a primary would have that comes from $3 contributions, none of this other special interest money. That money is and I think you would find the Congress of the United States much more responsive to the real needs of people. Our failure to address that is one of the reasons I hold so many town I've held more town meetings than any senator in Illinois history. It gives me exposed to a man or woman who may not even know the but who has real problems. I think it's important that we're exposed to what the average citizen is concerned about.
But aren't you also one of the largest recipients of PAC contributions in the Senate?
I am, and I want to change the system. I have to use the rules that exist. I can't play touch football if everybody else is playing tackle.
Well, we thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to your next real live visit to Southern Illinois and Makanda. We'll see you again soon in Southern Illinois.
You will see me very soon, Gary. Thank you.
And thank you, Senator Paul Simon, Democrat of Illinois and Southern Illinoisan. Thank you for watching these candidate interviews on Emphasis. We hope you'll stay with us throughout the rest of the season for many local, regional, state issues that we'll address right here on Emphasis. Thank you.